Thank you so much for taking the time to be interviewed today. I know you're very busy. Can we start by having you introduce yourself, maybe give a little bit of your background and where you do most of your work, your best work for the Democratic Party?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. It's a real honor to get to chat with you. And I'm Shasti Conrad. I am the chair of the Washington State Democrats. I have been chair of our state party since 2023. I'm in my second term, and I'm our youngest chair that we've ever had, and our first woman of color to lead the organization, and the first South Asian woman to lead a state party for either party in the entire country. And then just a few months ago, I was elected to be a DNC vice chair at large, and I'm the only Asian officer for the DNC at this time, and the only one who's currently residing in the Western states. So on the other side of most of our folks are on the East Coast, but it's a real pleasure to be here with you.
Well, I mean, East Coast is best coast, but I won't hold it against you. I won't hold it against you in this case. What exactly is the role of a vice chair in the Democratic Party? Most people know of Ken Martin, if you're following DNC politics, and how he got to the position and what he's doing. But most people might not know exactly what a vice chair does within the party structure.
hmm Yeah, I look at are the role as a vice chair is like you are a utility player there to help and support and uplift the work of our chair. Have known Ken. He was the state party chair before he was DNC chair, and so we worked well together these last couple of years, and really wanted to help support him and his vision, and leading a party that was more open and was more about supporting the work that's happening in the states. And I also see it as our job is to help to do the organizing work that we do at every level of the party. It's meeting with voters and supporters, and also having conversations and trying to move people towards the party. It's doing the organizing work of working with our local party organizations to plan events and do candidate recruitment, and sort of help raise funds for the party to be able to have the resources to do the organizing work, and really sort of help with setting the strategy and the vision for how can we win elections, up and down the ballot, across this whole country.
You are quite a young face for Democratic leadership. There is a perception, both in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, of a generational gap, that our political leaders are largely much older than the rest of the population, especially a lot of young people who are getting into politics, looking into their future. How do you think the Democratic Party is best situated, or I mean, what pathway should they take forward in order to answer this question of this generational gap between young people who are looking towards leadership that can relate to their struggles when it comes to housing affordability and the cost of living?
Well, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I love the most about the Democratic Party is that I think it's one of the few places, that we still have where it is truly an intergenerational community. I came into the Democratic Party. My first job was as an intern for the Washington State Democrats when I was a freshman in college. And, I had an opportunity to learn from people who had been organizing from the civil rights movement and who had been leaders for many, many, many years. But also I was around other young people and a part of our Young Democrats organizations. And, we're sort of bringing that kind of activist energy that, young people often bring. And, now I've been in this work for almost 20 years. And although, I know that young people don't really look at somebody who's, an elder millennial as a young person anymore, many times and in many spaces in the Democratic Party, I am the youngest person in the room, because there are, many times the rooms are predominantly folks that are, 65 and older. And I think, part of that is because those are folks who have time because they are retired. They aren't actively, maybe raising families at that time. They're not actively working. And so they have a bit more time to give to the sort of volunteer work that is such a huge part of Democratic Party organizing. But I also think that it's, really important that we are able to meet the moment, right, and talk about what is important to people, and that we recognize the issues that are facing young people. I think one of the biggest takeaways from last year was that the Democratic Party was not talking enough about cost of living, affordability, about issues that were directly impacting everybody, but particularly young people. And so I think we as a party have got to be doing a better job of that, but also that lived experience really matters. So having more candidates that come from, who are young, who can speak directly to the issues facing young people because they're living it right now, but also candidates that are renters, candidates that are, raising families right now, know about the childcare crisis, who are thinking about a sort of, dystopian climate future and thinking about, what do we have to look forward to? We need people to run for office who can speak to those things, because not only is it about connecting, but it's also about what policies are going to get, promoted and passed and pushed forward. And you need younger people to sort of help to highlight a lot of this.
Do you think that younger people getting involved in politics and running for office, is this a question of supply, whereas the candidates and the people in positions to, actually run those campaigns, to actually, run those positions, the reason why we don't have a ton of them is because they're not running and the Democratic Party wants to give those opportunities? Or is it a question that the Democratic Party um, rewards long-term commitment to the party in a way? I remember there was a question about different party leaders getting promoted due to their time in the party for decades, their experience, versus these really big new voices who have arrived to the party that young people really relate to, whether they, because of how much of an impact they've had, whether they should be moved to the front of the line or not. And I've saw this question be asked by progressive leaders, whether or not this long-term loyalty should take precedence over getting these new voices in the room. Do you see that as a question, or can you do both at the same time?
I mean, I think with so many things, right? It's both, it's structural in that I think, for a long time, the party was built as sort of this like kind of gatekeeper status, right? It was like these folks who were, sort of the smoke filled back rooms, right? Who were making the decisions about who they thought was a viable, quote, viable candidate. And a lot of times it was like people that they had known for a long time, their friends, they would decide that those were the people that could win. And then they would see people that they, didn't know, didn't have relationships with, who are younger, and they would say, wait your turn. No, you're not going to be able to do this. And then the resources would move to the people who they had deemed as being able to win these elections without actually knowing what would resonate with people, and like, giving people an opportunity to actually make these informed decisions about who best speaks to their issues, who are they connecting with. I do feel like that shift is occurring where you are seeing, look like up in Maine, right? You have like Graham Planther out there, who is like, never run for anything, not been in politics, but is a leading, candidate right now for the Senate seat in Maine. You have the challenges of, other people getting into the race, because I think sometimes there is a lot of fear about having, newer, sort of unvetted candidates running. But I think that it's important discussions that we're having right now about that we need as many people, sort of running for these positions and, speaking to democratic values and giving people an opportunity. I mean, I always say, I'm a true believer in democracy, in that I believe that voters should have a right to pick who represents them. And so, having healthy primaries is not a bad thing. It gives us an opportunity to really message and to connect with people and to hopefully get people to be really excited about their candidates. And I think I have seen my role of being more involved in the Democratic Party is I have learned how things work so that I can help to open these spaces up to people who have not always had access to them. Women, people of color, younger people, being able to help to demystify this process so that they can step forward and they can run, and we can change the structures by the different types of people that come into this work and changing how we do things, and also by electing different types of people who are going to push for different policies that will connect with people in a different way.
Is there any concern within the Democratic Party when you have very high profile figures that, have been the faces of, I would say, youth leadership in the party, like David Hogg, come into the position with a lot of fanfare, and then ultimately leave the position Of course, there's questions about the party's, bylaws and exactly, who should be there. Questions about representation that haven't been asked, that are starting to get asked, and I think those questions are valid. But the way that that all went down, do you worry at all that it has started to leave a bad taste in the mouths of activists? That the way that that was communicated could have been done better, or do you think that the party handled that appropriately?
Well, I think a lot of pieces were at play. And I think that, first, let me just say that, I got to know David through the process of running for vice chair, and I have a lot of respect and appreciation for him. I think he is, an incredible leader, and really had gotten to, care about David. And, there was a number of sort of issues that were at play during that time period. Number one is that the administration of the election on that final ballot for the final two seats for vice chair, there was an administrative flaw. It was confusing in the way that the ballots were done, and it actually harmed three women of color, myself included, because we did not have the same access to the same sort of voting base as the two male candidates did, David Hogg and Malcolm Kenyatta. And so there was a challenge to sort of redo that final ballot so that it was more equitable and more fair. That process started at the end of February and was happening sort of alongside the information of, David then saying, with his PAC, Leaders We Deserve, that he was going to be primarying Democratic incumbents. That information didn't come out until April from David. So these two things were happening at the same time, and I think they have gotten very sort of entangled, where the appearance and perception was certainly that it was that the redo of the election for vice chair was about removing David, but that's not actually the truth. And I still think there's an incredibly important role that David plays in our ecosystem, and has really energized not just young people, but our activist base, so many people across this country who were like, we need fighters, not folders. We need people who understand that it's not business as usual. We can't just sort of go along to get along. We've got to be really promoting people who are going to bring that fight into this work.
I know voices like James Carville and others, people who with the Clinton campaign, they were asking questions about exactly where that fight needs to be, because David seemed to be under the impression that the fight had to be inter-party, that they need to be confronting certain Democrats who are not either, you could say, progressive or not with the values that he wants to see the party head in the direction of. And there was a question on whether or not those resources should be spent. If you're the DNC, should you be spending money on against candidates inside the party, inside of primaries, when the DNC's job ultimately is to make Democrats win? That's what elections are about. They're about winning. Do you think there is, I guess I could just ask you directly, do you think it's the Democratic Party's job to make sure Democrats win, or to keep a certain amount of image for the party when looking at primaries, making sure that Democrats, so to speak, stay on the party line?
Hmm. Well, I mean, first of all, I think, this moment with, MAGA Republicans running wild, and, what you're seeing of this, people say like the path to fascism, but I think we're kind of like, we're basically there. It matters who is elected. Like, it matters who wins. Having a majority in the House matters. Having the presidency in the White House matters. So I think at the end of the day, the organizing work in the Democratic Party to win elections, is the primary focus. It has to be, because it matters who's in those seats. But I think that, like I said before, the importance of like running candidates and supporting candidates who represent their constituents is incredibly important. And, sometimes that is not going to be entirely sort of, party line. Sometimes that is going to be sort of pushing against a little bit of like how things have always been done. And I think that's really important. I mean, look, I worked on, both Obama campaigns. And I have to remind people, he was the progressive in 2008. And, he was not the party's chosen candidate for that nomination. And he built, Obama for America outside of the DNC, in part because he felt like he wasn't going to get the support from the internal party structure. So, I was on his campaign. I worked on both Bernie campaigns as well. And so, when we talk about neutrality, that's actually something that progressives have asked for from the DNC for a long time. We have not wanted the thumb on the scale that has so often been about protecting just the incumbent or protecting the sort of more moderate or more centrist candidate. I actually really give kudos to our chair, Ken Martin, who asked all of us officers to sign on to a neutrality pledge because, he said the people should be choosing who represents them. It shouldn't be the DNC. And so I do think that is a really important change that has occurred under Ken's leadership that is something that, as a progressive, we've asked for a long time.
So we were talking about voters and making sure the voters get have a voice. I wanted to talk about redistricting for a second because right now there seems to be, as the midterms are coming up, a big fight in Texas, and of course California has responded. Gavin Newsom has responded to the redistricting efforts in Texas in order to take away. It's very clear to take away Democratic Senate seats. I understand. I'm from Maryland. I'm not a big fan of Andy Harris, and seeing him redistrict would scratch a certain itch in my body. Okay, so I understand the appeal. Is there any worry though that this could be a race to the bottom, or is the main concern at the moment that the Republicans are pulling the trigger on gerrymandering anyway? So it's either put up or shut up when it comes to having some balance when it comes to the House and Senate. What's the perspective that you share?
Well, I mean, look, this is in response to the Republicans, doing this mid cycle redistricting, this and gerrymandering in order to steal, an election next year, and because they are worried that they wouldn't be able to win the House and that they're going to lose, to Democrats. That's why we are having to respond. I think no one on our side that I've heard wants to be doing this. Certainly the resources would be better spent focused on candidate recruitment and the work we need to do to win these elections. And, in a normal democracy, that's where we would be focusing on. And unfortunately, that's not where we are at. And I think we've had to recognize that we have to fight fire with fire. We have to be able to challenge Trump and these Republicans from what the redistricting that they're doing. And they are, JD Vance was just in Indiana talking about redistricting. I just read an article that North Carolina is looking to redistrict. They already did it in Texas and in Missouri. And so, it's unfortunately a bit of a whack-a-mole, but it is the moment that we are in right now, trying to preserve democracy and trying to beat them back at their own game.
It's sad too, because a lot of these independent redistrict commissions, it took decades to get bipartisan consensus to get these institutions implemented in these states. And it feels like, it's not even like, it takes half a decade. It's taking within 1 to 2 years for a lot of this social consensus to break down very rapidly.
Yes.
I understand your perspective is just still something that I'm very caught over personally. Speaking
and I should say, in our own Washington state, we have an independent redistricting commission, and so we're not able to redistrict. We have out of 10 seats, Democrats hold 8 of the congressional seats, and which is we're very proud of. But we were proud a number of years to set up the independent redistricting commission, and that is how it should function. It should be this bipartisan effort. It should be about just making fair lines and fair maps, so that people have access to being able to elect somebody that's representative of them. That is not the moment we are in. And so the blue states who have the ability to be able to answer what the Republicans are doing are having to make these tough calls. And I think today you saw President Obama come out in support of Prop 50 in California. This is just the moment that we are in.
Speaking about the midterms, fundraising for the RNC has outpaced the DNC. Generally speaking, since the election, it makes sense after winning an election, that generally you would be able to get more momentum. What is the DNC's path forward for trying to make up the fundraising gap between Republicans and Democrats? Because by the end of June, the RNC had about $80 million on hand. The Democratic Party had about $15 million on hand. So that's quite a substantive gap that has not been closed in that time. And if you're going to be catching up, which is what's going to be necessary in order to take the House back, that's going to mean making up money. But there's always, of course, the activist party critique that the people we're going to make this money might not be the people that we should be going to, that we should not be concentrating on these big dollar donations. You worked on the Bernie campaign, small dollar, one at a time, $5 donations. What should be the pathway to making up this gap?
Well, we did. I just heard some good news from our chair, which is that we've Ken's raised, I think, $85 million since he became chair, and it's the most that any new chair has raised. And he said, I think over 75% of the donations were small dollar donations, and really have been driven by our mobilization team, which I think, as I learned on the Bernie campaign and have seen, it really matters when it's powered by grassroots donors, and it changes where the focus often is, because, then you get to be more responsive to regular people and not just, your sort of higher, major donors. So, and some of them, the money, we're actually investing it into the elections that we have right now. The DNC has made historic investments in the, Virginia gubernatorial race and the New Jersey gubernatorial race. And we've got key races in Pennsylvania and also in Georgia and in California with Prop 50. And then also Ken increased the number of the amount of money that he's investing into the state parties, which is, as a state party chair, really does make a huge difference in being able to build out the infrastructure that should be able to help, win elections cycle after cycle. And so, I do think that we are leveling out. I mean, look, you lose a major election like we did last year, and you're gonna have to answer questions, and it's gonna take a minute for people to trust again and feel like they can trust that we know what we're doing and that we can win these elections. And I do think, we've got these major elections in the next couple of weeks. My hope is that we will be successful in those, and that will show people that we have the ability to win this year and beyond. And I really do think, Ken authored a resolution at our meeting in August to ban dark money. And so really has tried to take a more sort of progressive lens to how we raise money, how we spend money. And I think that's, that's what we've all been calling for so long. So good work happening.
I got a bunch of questions. I've got little time, so I want to make sure I get through my big questions. I have to ask you about the shutdown. I come from Maryland, gorgeous Prince George's, and I'm surrounded by federal workers. A lot of people have obviously in the last 9 months lost their job. People working, good people at DHS. I know the Agricultural Research Center, my grandmother worked out all the time. That building is getting shut down. There's huge budget cuts across the board. And there's a question about whether these people some people are going to be permanently laid off, which is not usually the standard during shutdowns. Remember growing up, and it's like, okay, we don't get ice cream this weekend, maybe in a few weekends when we start getting paid again. But a lot of people don't know. And it seems to be like deliberately partisan, openly partisan from how the president is talking about it. At this point, do Democrats think that they have the messaging advantage? I've seen the polling numbers. People see that Republicans control the government. They're the ones that people are holding large on a plurality accountable at this point. But do Democrats feel comfortable in their position right now, especially as federal employees, the longer this goes on, are going to continue to feel the heat?
Right. I mean, I think no one's happy. Democrats are not happy that we are in this situation, but it is, and the Republicans have to own this. They are in the seat of power, and I was just seeing a data point that Trump has now been president for more than half of the days that the government has been shut down in all of the United States' history. And so, they don't care about what's happening to, government employees. They don't care about people like your grandmother, right? Like, they are not bothered. And I think they also see it as a way of laying off some of these people permanently because they just won't bring them back. And, Democrats, we're not going to, this time around, we're not going to capitulate if it meant that people's health insurance premiums were going to skyrocket. And so they've had to be holding the line, trying to fight for, the American people to say, look, like, this budget is not okay. We're not going to let this do the damage that they want it to do. But certainly, I think no one feels great about the fact that, so many government workers across this country are, suffering, are, struggling to make ends meet. And, this is not, nobody wants to be in this. This is not how it should work. This is not normal. And, I do think this time around, Republicans are really, Democrats are making Republicans have to own that this is on them and that they have to come to the table and
I think the one thing that gave me pause was watching Marjorie Taylor Greene go on cable news and start talking about the need to make a deal on health care. To see these types of figures feel like they're under pressure because their constituents, if you actually look at the demographics of who they're supposed to represent, are people who largely benefit from the healthcare expansions, from the Affordable Care Act, from these programs which have been under the hammer from Republican messaging during the shutdown pretty consistently. We don't have a lot of time left, so I want to ask maybe one or two more questions if you'll give me that ability. I wanted to ask about going into spaces that makes Democrats uncomfortable. There was a big question about post-election whether or not Harris should have gone into more spaces like the Joe Rogan Experience, into places where maybe it wouldn't have been the most welcoming to every single part of the message that she brought forward, but would have been getting more eyes and ears for voters going through the election. Is this something that the party thinks was in any way consequential about where she went to communicate online in this era of 21st century podcaster communication where people are getting the news from alternative sources? Is there any question about, doing more of what, I don't want to use Gavin Newsom as the standard here, but doing more podcasts on places where people disagree with us, where we're trying to get out there and put our messages in front of maybe even sometimes hostile audiences, but the idea is all eyes are good eyes. Is that a messaging strategy that is being considered more?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that has been heard loud and clear, which is that we have to be messaging everywhere. We can't take it for granted. And I think Republicans figured out faster than we did on our side that people were getting their sort of news and forming their political opinions in non-political spaces. That they were really getting a lot of that shaped on these kind of like lifestyle podcasts or these sort of opinion-based spaces. And we were still sort of trapped in more sort of traditional media and these other spaces that, like, we talked about young people earlier, are certainly not going to the New York Times, right, and like reading up, and they're not watching the evening news and things like that. And I think we did miss that a bit, and I do think now it is like we got to go everywhere, and we've got to go into places where we're not going to get 100% agreement, but that's okay. I think that there's a lot of things that we can agree on, and we need to be really like listening to people, like doing more of the engagement around making sure that we are hearing people and being responsive to their real needs. And I think one of the things that, the Democratic Party sort of suffered a bit is like in our desire to try to make every group feel seen and important, we ended up making everybody feel like they weren't. It was like this group versus this group versus this group versus that group, instead of being like, hey, what we all are dealing with? The fact that we want to be able to put food on the table and take care of our kids and not worry about whether we're going to get able to stay in our homes and keep a roof over our head. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about union jobs. Like these are things that everybody can relate to.
Yeah, I did wonder sometimes because I'll listen to some of the messaging and I understand it comes from a good place, but sometimes it feels like like people are going down a list and kind of checking off different groups of people. And it almost feels like you're going through some sort of like official royal ceremony where you're just naming all of the parts of the kingdom of the big tent party. Right. Versus kind of universally appealing messaging, like the idea of going over like affordability of housing. No matter who you are, that's even going to do better than say talking about first-time home buyers, because that's one group of the population,
Right.
whereas affordable housing is everybody wants affordable housing, whether you're paying your mortgage, whether you're paying your rent. That's universally appealing. Um, one or two. I'm sorry. As a journalist, of course I squeeze everything I can out of it. As a queer person going into the midterm election, I'm a little concerned because I feel that some of the conclusions that are being taken from the last election, especially in reaction to a certain Republican ad of Harris is for they, them, not you. You know, this ad,
Right.
which according to the Republican Party and their staffers did very, very well. There's been some pulling back on the idea of maybe we shouldn't be leaning in so hard on LGBTQ plus rights, specifically the T as part of LGBTQ plus rights. And this is something that should take a back seat in messaging and not a front seat. Um, is that something that is the real conversation that's happening in Democratic Party leadership? Or is this something that the Democratic Party leadership has said, trans rights are human rights. At the end of the day, we have to take a stance on this. We're not going to abandon parts of the Big Tent coalition. That kind of goes against the whole purpose of the Big Tent coalition. How does the Democratic Party see messaging on queer issues going into the midterms?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I often say we, can be sort of universal in our values and localized in our messaging. We as Democrats, I mean, one of the reasons why I am a Democrat is because we stand up for human and civil rights, and we have got to be in for people who come from oftentimes marginalized, communities. We cannot throw the LGBTQIA plus community under the bus in our desire to. One of the things that was really frustrating to me was there was this like in the aftermath of 2024, there's this like pitting of economic issues versus social issues. And it's like, no, we all are part, like we deal with economic issues, but we also have our own identities that are incredibly important to us that impact our economic, our experiences with the economy as well. So it's not either or. It's really important that we are standing up for people that are vulnerable and we're not throwing them under the bus and letting them be attacked and letting their rights be taken away. But at the same time, we can also say we need to be focusing on how we can help everybody and like here are some of these key policy issues that we can take up that will impact everybody, including supporting the trans community and the LGBTQI community and whatnot.
Last question, and I'm in Ukraine, so if I didn't ask about Ukraine, I wouldn't be invited back to certain bars. Um, uh, the Democratic Party's position on Ukraine has shifted markedly since the Obama administration. I remember the Mitt Romney debates with Barack Obama saying like, oh, you have the policy of the Cold War, your foreign policy, and being as aggressive as you are towards the Russians. And during the Obama administration, of course, there was no kinetic response to the Russian invasion of Crimea. It was largely sanctions, and then we largely ignored it, to be quite frank. But now it has largely been the Republican Party that has dragged its feet on the issue of Ukraine, and Democrats have been quite consistent in their support for Ukraine across the board. And any times that there's even been the slightest hint of, I don't know, it's largely been dealt with. Like that letter that was sent by some of the progressive members of the House that basically vanished into the ether almost upon its release. Do you think that this is a transformation that's going to be upheld going through the midterms? Because once Democrats, I'm being hopeful here, once Democrats control the House again, a lot of people would like to see the party that has been most consistently supportive of Ukraine use that leverage to make sure that it's not just questions about Donald Trump talking, because that's mostly what he does on Ukraine is talk, but that we use that leverage to support Ukraine. Is that a priority, or is that not as much a priority for the Democratic Party going into the midterms, using that leverage, considering most people are very focused right now on domestic issues?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, like I would love to spend, a half an hour with you listening to your experience and hearing what you're seeing, because I think, it's incredibly important to get that kind of like firsthand witness account of what you're seeing. I think that the people of Ukraine have really shown such strength and resilience, and the fight that like those of us in the United States on the Democratic Party side, as we're watching our democracy sort of crumble in front of our eyes, we look to the people of Ukraine as like they were ahead of us in like, sort of fighting off these like authoritarian governments and leaders and whatnot that want to take away our rights. So I think absolutely, I think the Democratic Party will continue to stand with the people of Ukraine. I think that I actually was just in Taiwan on a delegation trip in September. And for me to, it really sort of highlighted the fragility of democracies around the world, and how those of us who truly believe in, freedom and liberty and rights have to stick together across this whole world, and we are seeing the rise of these far right authoritarian governments on every continent, in every space. And, Ukraine really has led the way for these, many years, and we cannot abandon, and we have to stand by and do everything we can. And when we're back in power, do everything we can.
Do you think they'll leverage their position in the House as Republican majorities were leveraged during the Biden administration to hold back Ukraine aid?
I'm not privy to those types of decisions, but I would certainly hope so. And I think, I'm close with Representative Pramila Jayapal, who's the chair emeritus of the Progressive Caucus. And I know, certainly very important to her. And the Progressive Caucus has been very strong in pushing. So, I think, I would hope so.
Thank you so much for your frankness. Thank you for going a little bit over the time today. And thank you. I appreciate it. And I hope you have a good rest of your week.
You too. Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.